Today's episode features Dr. Paul McTague, who is undoubtedly one of the greatest forest biometricians of our time. He has led an interesting career, spending tenure in academia, leading biometrics research in industry, and now working as a consulting biometrician. His insights on the relationship between industry and academia were quite interesting, and I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. So please help me welcome my friend, Dr. Paul McTague. Hey, Paul. Thanks and welcome to the first episode of my new podcast, The Forester's Forecast, where I interview famous biometricians such as yourself, and we talk about your life and where you've been and where we're going. So again, thank you and welcome.
Okay, Mickey, I'm delighted to be here. I don't have large experience with podcasts, but on occasion I've had a request or two. Also, Brazilian forest professional groups have interviewed me. There, it's more common to use written questions.
Yeah.
So this will be a little different for me.
Yeah, this is going to be a little bit different. And, it shouldn't be much different than you and I sitting around having a couple of beers and a conversation. So hopefully, I think things will go well. And again, I think it's just, normal conversations.
Okay.
So let's talk about you. You are a PhD in biometrics. You had a early career in industry, went on to be a tenured professor, worked as a biometrician for one of the biggest forest management companies in the world, and now consulting biometrician. Is there anything you can't do?
Well, thank you. That's really a very generous comment.
Yeah.
But I've had a very rewarding career, and it's been fun. Not everything was smooth sailing, especially let's say in the early 2000s, when I really did have a strong interest in returning to the area of academia here in the Southeast. And for a variety of reasons, it just didn't happen. So I stayed within industry, but then remained quite active. And I'll touch upon this during the discussion today. Quite active with research, you might say, with third-party organizations such as NCASI, the National Council for Industry Improvement, and working with task forces with the Forest Service. So that was very rewarding. Why don't I get started and really tell a little about my career and start off first with what would be on any resume or CV, as we would say, education.
Yeah.
So in 1974, I got my undergraduate degree in forestry at Syracuse, followed 2 years later by a Master of Forestry, specializing in forest economics at Yale University. And then a full 5 years later, returned from South America to the United States, and then pursued a degree in forest biometrics at the University of Georgia. Something interesting about Syracuse, because really in my youth as a lad, I grew up in South America. I was very fortunate to have a youth in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I had an interest in returning to Brazil upon completion of the degree to work. In my third year at Syracuse, however, I decided to think about semester abroad. And so unofficially, I attended a Brazilian university. Rather unofficially, it was not sanctioned really by the university, but I was able to transfer the credits later, and studied at the Federal University of Viçosa in Brazil. But I did return to Syracuse, completed my degree there. Interesting thing about Yale University, I was really deeply interested in forest economics. In my last semester, I took a course, however, 3-credit course under Dr. George Furnival. And that is what sparked my interest
Yeah.
in forest biometrics, growth and yield, especially.
Yeah.
And I went later upon completion of that degree to work in Brazil. But Dr. Furnival was able to spark something there. And I had a deep interest in biometrics. And that's why 5 years later, after Yale, I pursued that PhD then at the
Yeah.
University of Georgia.
Wow. Can you tell us? So, you're from New York State, is that right?
No, originally from New England,
Originally
from
from New
Connecticut.
England. Okay.
Yes.
And then you went to, followed your dad took you down to Brazil, where you spend most of your
Yes.
youth, and then you came back. But as far as I know about Rio de Janeiro, it's a very large city. Not a lot of forest industry in the inner city there. What got your interest into forestry in general? What made you go back to Syracuse to study forestry?
I suppose really it had to be vacations that the family would take. We would return to the United States on a yearly basis.
Mhm.
And my parents on both sides were very familiar with the Adirondacks in New York, specifically the Paul Smith area.
Mhm.
And that's white pine country up there.
Yeah.
Very beautiful with lots of lakes. And I just loved it. I fell in love with the area and I fell in love with that and said, this is what I want to do. Of
Yeah.
course, with a lot of romantic notions
Yeah.
about forestry, something that many of us indeed have
Mm.
about this. So but that's what sparked it. Um, yes, you're right. I had a very privileged youth in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Um, Surfing, beach, and things like
Yeah.
that. So very different from forestry, but
Yeah.
um, that's what sparked my interest then to return to the United States, and I went to Syracuse University.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a little about my early career, though. In Brazil, I worked for a forest products company known as Olencraft. They were based out of the United States. Um, in let's see, West Monroe, Louisiana is where they were based. And they had a mill in southern Brazil, and that's where I worked. It was exciting work for me because I worked in a variety of areas. I ran the forest nursery, not especially large, bare root seedlings, about a production of about only 2 million
Yeah.
seedlings a year. Typically we talk about nurseries here in the United States where 40 million or plus in terms of production,
Right.
but also worked in tree improvement and some rudimentary type of growth and yield research. And I quickly realized I had reached my limit. I had to acquire more training if I was going to do more advanced work in it.
Mm.
But working in this developing region in southern Brazil was exciting. Uh, I was at a mill that was about 50 kilometers away from the nearest asphalt road. I lived in company housing. My wife from the city of Rio, this was equally foreign to her because she was not used to having only dirt roads in the area. But it was exciting work. I felt, had a profound impact on the local economy, perhaps impeding some of the type of migration that was so common from the traditional rural sectors to the large modern urban centers. They were staying in the local area because we were providing real improvement in the standard of living there. It was exciting work. I imagine much like what people experience when they volunteered for the Peace Corps decades
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
Um, so it was really exciting work, but I had that interest. I had that desire to learn more of forest biometrics, to get a mastery of it. And so then that is why I returned in 1981 to the United States to pursue that degree at the University of Georgia.
Yeah. And who did you study with at Georgia?
My major professor was Bob Bailey,
Oh, great.
and on the committee initially were the greats, Jim Fortson, Jerry Clutter.
Yeah.
and um, and Glenn Ware from the stats department, though he also had training in forestry. Of course, Professor Clutter um, passed away, and Leon Pinar stepped into the um, graduate committee and also a head of professor of differential equations from the math department, who was on my committee too.
Yeah. Wow. That's an exciting group of people to work with. I imagine it was just such a rewarding experience to have them on your committee, and no doubt the reason you are the master of biometrics that you are today.
Well, thank you. Yes, I owe a great debt of gratitude to all of those gentlemen. Always very receptive, all of them, to me. Um, and Bob Bailey was really very interested in the work. Um, just to give you an idea, when I submitted my uh, dissertation for him to review, and it was a very long dissertation, 200 and some odd type pages.
Wow.
He reviewed the thing in the entire weekend and
Yeah.
gave it back to me. So very, very conscientious, and I'm very grateful for the help that all of them gave, really. Um, well, upon that, I was determined I was not going to return to South America
Hmm.
for working with forest products industry. I wanted to go into academia. And I ended up then at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, elevation of 7,000 feet.
Yeah.
So, which most people aren't aware of, that was rather cool weather, very, very snowy.
Yeah.
So, easily over 100 inches of snow a year at that
Wow.
high altitude.
Yeah.
And no longer the fast growing forest that I was accustomed to from the subtropics of the southern hemisphere, but these were much slower growing, almost semi arid forests, the ponderosa pine,
Right.
especially.
Right.
Um, Rewarding work for me at Northern Arizona University had to be the fruit of a large research grant that I had with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it was for work on growth and yield on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. Of course, Fort Apache was very well known at that time through some television series, I think it was involving police work
Yeah.
in New York City. And a particular uh, police station was known as Fort Apache. Uh, we, we didn't have any glamorous things like that on the Fort Apache. Um, but in some ways, it was not unlike work in a developing country. The Apache Indian Reservation had large unemployment, but close knit families. And they were always very warm to me, very hospitable to me. So I enjoyed working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and almost all of their employees were actually tribal members. Now,
Yeah.
this is no longer common in the US West to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs running the forestry operations. This has been um, really transferred to tribal forestry units. Once the tribes were able to send sufficient number of their tribal members to forestry schools, acquire that professional training, many of them returned, and then over time, functions were passed from the BIA over to tribal forestry units. And
Hmm.
that would be the case today on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation.
Excellent. It's my understanding that, I guess, mostly on the federal lands, that much of the ponderosa pine forest is protected, that harvesting is mostly restricted or only in, certain cases they're allowed to. Is this still your understanding of it, or, am I off base here?
The tribal forestry units truly did like to manifest their own sovereignty
Good.
and to determine their own cutting patterns. their own management systems. This manifested itself primarily in the use of uneven age management.
Mm.
They did not have an interest in engaging in types of clear cutting and then replanting. They were interested more in selection methods for cutting and relying on natural regeneration.
Hmm.
Intensity of the cuts and the type of residual densities following partial cuts was a source of contention between the tribes and the BIA, uh, especially in a politically charged state like Arizona. I don't believe this has changed one bit, but water and the water resource had a value somewhat short of gold.
Yeah.
They were very valuable. And so claims had been made uh, that in many cases the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in their partial cuts, had reduced the basal areas to low levels so that there would be increased surface flow of water, which would go downstream and to the large urban centers
Yeah.
like Phoenix. So a lot of litigation occurred over this. I believe more recently, however, much of these claims of intensity of the cut and the residual basal areas is largely being dictated also by incidents of wildfires.
Mm.
So there have been some intense wildfires on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, uh, primarily in the western part of the reservation in a place called Civicu, and which later spread to national forests, also adjoining national forests.
Hmm.
So the entire issue of intensity of cuts and the residual basal areas after partial cutting, yeah, water has some influence on it, but I think fire protection is also another
Right.
driving force for that.
Right.
But the Indian reservation established its own allowable cut that was not determined by outside forces.
Yeah.
At that time, the Indian reservation had two sawmills. One of them was quite large, production of about 90 million Scribner board feet a year.
Wow.
Um, and I know that one of the mills closed and the others had some trouble, so I'm not aware of the current status of the Fort Apache Indian Timber Company, as it was called, FATCO at that time.
Hmm.
But the forest parks industry was a real driver for employment. Tribal crews, which conducted inventory and other functions, fire protection also, were all tribal. And they had a very big impact on the way that forest was being managed.
Yeah.
Uh, they also had a wonderful system of CFI, continuous forest inventory, and that's what I worked with, that type of data, and it still is remeasured. So, very valuable data coming
Yeah.
off the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. Um,
Well, I'm glad you
thinking,
mentioned the
yeah,
CFI because I was just recently reading your paper published in 22 on continuous forest inventory. I don't know if this might be a good time to discuss it or we can wait till later, but I thought the idea is quite interesting and it was something new to me. I actually in all of my years had never heard of a continuous forest inventory in the manner that you had presented it. Of course, in the title, a new paradigm. Is this just an idea that you had evolving over the years, or can you tell us
yes,
about it?
that yeah, we can delve a little into that. That primarily, in recent years, I've had two publications mostly focused toward major problems that I detect in Brazil and
Hmm.
in South America in general. One is the heavy reliance on CFI, continuous force inventory, In other words, remeasurement of permanent plots. And those are the only type of plots that are installed.
Yeah.
Yet the attribute of growth is not really of interest to them. And when they analyze the remeasured data from CFI, they're not looking at growth. It's just current standing volume.
Yeah.
And it seems like an expensive system to me. And I thought one that could be slightly altered to give very valuable information.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a movement in Brazil now to reduce the intensity of the plots of the continuous forest inventory,
Mm-hmm.
the permanent plots. But I don't see any move to supplement it with much cheaper temporary plots.
Right.
So it was a system that I felt was adopted in Brazil without much thought. It's been used without many questions about it,
Mm-hmm.
its efficiency, and I felt it was time for needs for change. And another problem I had in Brazil was the propensity for the foresters to create new volume equations almost on whim. So any local compartment, any local forest, any age class difference, they're rushing out and doing destructive sampling and making new volume equations, but often with an inadequate sample size for that. As you know, our volume equations here in the southeast of the United States typically have a lifespan of 30 to 40 years.
Right.
And we recognize now that new equations are needed, but we're doing the data collection very systematically across numerous physiographic regions and timber types.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not likely, once we get the new equations, to be changing them sort of willy-nilly. So I was looking for a system in that forest ecology and management article that dealt with the new volume equation, with a system that would have more permanence, less need to run out and feel compelled to derive new volume equations.
Yeah, I'm assuming the labor costs there being a little bit less expensive than here could be driving some of that. I don't imagine here in the Southeast or much less anywhere else in the US that destructive sampling could just occur, continuously. It's just quite expensive as we know.
Yeah, I think your observation is right.
Yeah.
Plus, simply, it was something that had been implemented. I'm not sure how it got started, but not questioned.
Yeah.
And so I was questioning that. If I could, Mickey, let me just step back to Northern Arizona University. I had
Mhm.
an experience perhaps a little different than what other forest biometric professors encounter. I worked very heavily with mathematics and statistics department at
Mhm.
Northern Arizona University. I felt that we needed to get a graduate level sampling class in our school. And the statistics department felt like they needed a graduate level 400, 600 level, you might say, between seniors and grad students, course on sampling themselves. And so we talked about it, decided that we would join forces, co-teach it, and then when push came to shove, I taught it, but I taught the course in the mathematics department.
Okay.
And I enjoyed that immensely. I
Hmm.
really did, because with the course being taught in the math department, we had very, very good students, and the level then was kept quite high in it. And there was a real advantage in that when I taught growth and yield and biometrics at the graduate level in the forestry school, I was able to bring in all those math students, the graduate level math students from the math department.
Oh, wow.
They were obliged to take one course for the completion of their master's degree outside the department. So their advisors quickly advised them, go take that course over in forestry.
Oh, wow.
So I was able to bring and so it really helped me immensely. I was always able to meet the quota. Sometimes if you didn't have a quota, you couldn't teach class. always able to teach it. Typically, I would have about 11 to 14 students in my graduate level biometrics class. So
Yeah.
that was a delight.
Yeah. And I
Uh,
know I can't tell you how many people have told me, have gone through PhDs in biometrics, and then they say, John Paul taught me advanced sampling techniques. So that has
Wonderful,
that has
wonderful.
worked quite well in your continuing to educate others. So
Oh, thank you
yeah,
so
I'm very
much.
much appreciative of that.
Yes, and I just recently completed one of those at NC State.
Mm,
Currently, I'm on the committee of a graduate student at NC State, and that's exactly what I did. Those old notes I never discarded; that served
right.
me well. So I've reused them and updated them a little. Also, one more thing at Northern Arizona University, on 2 occasions, I was very fortunate to get a Fulbright Award, and this was as a senior lecturer. And so I then taught at the University of Sao Paulo
Mm,
at the agricultural campus in Piracicaba, Sao Paulo.
mhm.
And I did that on 2 occasions, and it was just a delight. Anybody who can get a Fulbright, I highly recommend it. Uh, it paid quite well. They were even able to pay the expense for my children to go to an American school
Yeah.
in one of the cities there. So it was really a real delight, and I enjoyed
Yeah,
it very
I
much.
think those Fulbrights they're amazing for getting people out and around and experiencing new things. I know when I was in my master's advisor, Dean Coble, his wife Teresa, got a Fulbright to Taiwan. And so in my last semester, their whole family went to Taiwan. And I was thinking like, oh no, like what am I gonna do? I have to finish a degree. And then they brought me along with them for, a few weeks to finish up my thesis. And so that was an amazing experience
Yes.
to get to go
Okay.
there. And
Yeah.
he was able to sit with in the office of Dr. Gan down there in Taiwan, and I was able to, see some of what they're doing. So I do think that many people should apply for Fulbrights and try to get that international experience. I think it's amazing.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. One of the things I did at NAU, Northern Arizona, um, was I did a little consulting for Georgia Pacific, and they were interested in working with a data set of hardwoods from the North Carolina State University hardwood co-op, and Professor Bob Kellison was in charge of that co-op, and so I completed that project for GP. And I had already known Dr. Kellison because, in 1981, I had taken a graduate level course at NC State in tree improvement. As I mentioned, in South America, I was doing some
Mm-hmm.
tree improvement. Well, all of this pays off. The work that you put into these particular disciplines will always pay off at some time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not wasted effort. And that's because I recently completed a research project for UGA, wrote a technical report trying to incorporate genetic breeding values into predicting the gain in growth and yield.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that knowledge came forward. But the reason why that working with Bob Kellison from NC State was so important is Bob Kellison left NC State and went to work for Champion Corporation. And lo and behold, I got a call one day from Bob Kellison and said, "How would you like to move to Pensacola, Florida?" Well, the white beaches of Pensacola,
Yeah.
that's quite an attraction.
Yeah.
And I think at that particular time, I was shoveling snow in Flagstaff. The piles of snow are higher than my height of 6'2". It sounded attractive. And he said, "Your effort would be leading a growth and yield research program nationwide. So that would include the Northeast, Maine, and New England, all the southern states, the Lake states, and the Pacific Northwest.
Wow.
You'll have it all," he said. Well, I took the offer and moved with Champion, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
And all of my colleagues at Champion loved it. It was just a delightful experience. 2.5 years later, however, we were gobbled up by International Paper
Mm.
in a takeover, and that experience was mm, let's just say it wasn't equal to that of champion. It was oftentimes very contentious, uh, very charged, very heated, less focused on science, more focused on power.
Mm,
And I didn't remain there too long and went to work for a TMO then as a managing partner in Atlanta. It's called Timberland Investment Resources, still
mhm,
there.
mhm,
Uh, and for a number of reasons, I also left that after 3 years and then went to work for Rayonier.
mhm.
Um, so sometimes I get a question from folks, what's the biggest difference between working for academia versus working for industry?
Mm,
And I've heard many of these talks. Sometimes they'll get into the difference between applied research versus what they'll call more pure research. I don't really like that term pure too much, but it's often used. I will say that oftentimes in industry, we're confronted with issues that require a lot of analysis, not necessarily research where we're establishing new experiments, new field trials, and so forth.
mhm.
But oftentimes we're confronted with a problem. We might have a lesser species, say here in the South, it could be sand pine, it could be Virginia pine. And we have bits and pieces of research. We're trying to put them together into a compatible system, you might say, where we can extract stand level information and tree level information.
Mhm.
So we're pooling various sources, and typically it requires really an advanced degree to get through all of that and do some of the mathematical manipulation. So that would just be an example of
Yeah.
applied type of research that we would do.
Yeah.
But oftentimes people say, isn't it wonderful working for industry? They're so good at making decisions. And that was never my experience. And lo and behold, talking to my former major professor, Bob Bailey, who worked for Weyerhaeuser, and in fact ran the unit in Hot Springs for research, it was never his experience either.
Yeah.
It just simply isn't true. Universities have set procedures, committees they form, but they do make decisions. And sometimes in industry, there's a propensity to not make decisions, push it off to the side for a while, let the problem aggravate.
Do you think it could also be an issue of just the size of the company? And I'm thinking you mentioned Weyerhaeuser being, pretty much the largest forest management company there is. And, I see that sometimes there are silos that are built that don't necessarily communicate well together. And I'm not saying that about Weyerhaeuser. I'm just saying I've seen that over the industry.
Mhm.
Whereas, at the company that I work for, Larson and McGowan, we're rather smaller. So I have, I think, maybe a much larger impact in the company than others might have because we're smaller. And so I can, make decisions on the fly that get implemented immediately. Whereas others, there's lots of red tape to go through. Have any comments on that?
No, I think you make a good point there. It's the large corporations that will have that. And oftentimes it's people that who understand the topic the least are the ones that are making the adamant
Yeah.
decisions and grinding their heels that why something can't be done.
Right.
But in general, I don't find industry much more adept at decision making
Mm.
than I do academia, at
Yeah.
least from a professional researcher. One thing I will say, and this might be for younger professionals, researchers with a PhD, is irrespective of whether it's industry or academia, adherence to the scientific method for research is paramount.
Mm.
I've seen more research projects get lost, deviate, not produce conclusive results in both camps, industry and academia, because they don't adhere to the scientific method.
Hmm.
They just flounder.
Right.
And good research is going to be conducted at both. I made a point, certainly when working with industry, certainly after the completion of my PhD, that a research report, a technical report, would be written at the level of any peer reviewed scientific article.
Mm.
It wasn't divulged, it was proprietary, but it had that level.
Yeah.
And I think that's still important. Uh, so the same principles have to be applied anywhere, in
Mm.
my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I see quite a bit and of I review for many of the journals, and I see sometimes, graduate students' papers come through, and it's a very detailed introduction with the hypothesis set out, and then immediately you get to the results and discussion, and it's something has changed. So, I believe the issue going forward is, yeah, we had this plan and that's what's implemented in the introduction, but then the results maybe didn't come out the way they thought they were going to, and then we had to find some way to get this paper published. um,
Yes.
which I think it happens, and that's okay. I mean, one of the goals of the master's thesis is to get a paper published, but I think a little bit more advisement into maybe reorganizing the introduction and the
Yes. And
stated hypothesis.
this is clearly where older, more experienced research people really have to step in and guide much better.
Yeah.
Um, the early graduate students, it should never be sink or swim.
Right.
Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of that. I know of experiences where the major professor never provided any guidance. And unfortunately, I know of one where the major professor never even read the thesis.
Yeah.
This is inexcusable. So it should never be sink or swim for young researchers. They're desperately looking for guidance, they're desperately looking for some help. They want to succeed. And
Yeah.
it's up to the older, more experienced researchers to make them succeed, in my mind. So,
Yeah.
scientific method, you can't go wrong with it.
Right.
Okay. We should never be attempting to do damage control. That
Mhm.
is the antithesis, I find, of
Right.
research.
But I wonder how much these days is, we have a stated hypothesis or something that we submit in a grant proposal, but then at the end of the day, it's just going through data and trying to make something out of it and trying to get that published because it is a publish or perish system in academia these days. And so I think that's a bit unfortunate that a lot of things are being published that maybe shouldn't necessarily be published because of that issue. And again, we're dealing with such big data these days, relatively to recent history, that you could just have grad students going all day and night analyzing data, looking for patterns, that kind of thing. So uh, uh, I wonder if you have any comments on that. On you've been out of you're recently getting back into academia as an adjunct and you're advising grad students as you always have, but do you have any comment on that, on the publish or
Well,
perish system?
I think the publisher perish. It's evident we see some marginal papers.
Mm,
Um, Not just academia. The Forest Service can be certainly accused of
yeah.
having some work of very marginal importance.
Right.
Um, but if you think about it, when we set up an experiment, that null hypothesis can be important. And I'm going to go to that consortium that was set up here in the South. Now, Larson McGowan is a recent member of that consortium, the Southern Pine Volume and Weight Consortium. Our null hypothesis, sort of driving this, well, I guess the null hypothesis would be that volume and weight relationships for second generation loblolly pine plantations had not changed. And so we were trying to disprove it and say, we believe it's changed.
Right.
But we set the project up with a 2-year time horizon.
Mm-hmm.
And within that, working from only the Western Gulf area of the US South, we were able to disprove that and say, indeed, it has changed. We need new volume and weight equations. Let's grow our consortium. Let's move southwide. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what's happened then with phase two. And I think that's the way to handle it. Of course, I'm not sure that won't necessarily release in a lot of external peer-reviewed publications, but it certainly will generate internal uh, company
Right.
publications.
And I could you just explain for the listeners who maybe not be familiar with that, what the Southern Pine Wade Consortium is and how it came to be?
Sure. Um, this was primarily generated because we felt that some of the large research cooperatives involved in growth and yield and biometrics in the US South really didn't have an interest or felt a need to start constructing new volume equations or engaging in destructive sampling. Uh, Especially our interest was on green weight, and I had some ideas on how I felt we could incorporate additional stand level information into the equations to make them more precise,
Mm-hmm.
namely attributes like stand age or other attributes that would always be available at the time of an inventory, such as relative position of that tree, the subject tree, with respect to the diameter distribution, or ideas of density,
Mm-hmm.
relative spacing, or dominant height. There was little interest from the research cooperative, so we felt we could do this on our own, and we got a number of companies interested, set up the hypothesis, set up the 2-year planning horizon, let's go do it. Had some planning meetings for it. But what was unique is we didn't set up any type of administrative overhead.
Right.
We did it ourselves, and we were very fortunate to use the National Council of Air and Stream Improvement to handle the bookkeeping for us.
Right.
And this worked out very well. And we're beginning to see some of this model being emulated by others.
Mm.
And I think it's worked out very, very well for us.
Yeah.
So that initial consortium in phase one, which had 5 industrial members, is now grown to 13.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very satisfying in the month of January of this year when the consortium members really manifested distinct approval of what we were doing and a gratitude for the success of it. Very different than other consortiums. We're not interested in developing models per se. We're interested in generating the data, and the
Right.
individual members will handle their own analysis.
Which is 85% of the cost is the data collection, right?
Yes,
So,
it is,
and
without question.
you mentioned that you're seeing others emulate this, but I think one of the issues with the data collection is not only is it so costly, but going through cooperatives that are attached to a university generally have high overhead. Now, I know some are able to get around it in ways, but when you're paying 40 to 60% in overhead on already costly data collection,
Yes.
that becomes problematic. Do you think more of these consortiums may be implemented in the future for other growth and yield type projects?
I believe so. I know that Professor Aaron Weiskittle at the University of Maine, who is currently also directing CAFS attached to the National Science Foundation, CAFS, which is the Center for Advanced Forestry Systems, is very much interested in this type of model. And I believe we're going to see a lot more of this where industry is trying to work more closely with the National Science Foundation and other real, you might say, donors
Mm-hmm.
out there, working with groups that have much lower administrative costs.
Right.
So I think this is a model that will be followed. I'm
Mm-hmm.
quite certain it will be.
Yeah.
Um, But you mentioned something about peer review of journals, and this was a topic that I was also going to address. I think it's important for young professionals to think a little about how can I serve my forest science community.
Hmm.
Now, this could be true for a university professor, an assistant professor, could be true for somebody working with industry, or perhaps a research organization. It's important that we continue the peer review of journals. And unfortunately, I've heard some just say, well, I don't have the time to do it, and hence I won't do it.
Hmm.
And that's not really very constructive for the advancement of our science if we were to take those type of attitudes.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed working with the NACASI, the National Council of Air and Stream Improvement, because we stay focused on a lot of key uh, topics that are of interest to industry, that are interest to really the whole forest products sector. And if we have to think about this, how do we keep this sector competitive? How do we keep it a leader in the world? Um, we have to have really some more advanced approaches to the way we manage the forests.
Hmm.
And so I think something like NACASI is important. The Society of American Foresters has also recently created some task forces, whether it be in forest carbon modeling or small area estimation. I'm involved in both, and I enjoy this. I think it's a good association. I would encourage others to think about getting involved in that type of thing.
Well, do you have any advice for, others, young biometricians and quantitative folk in the industry, how they can get involved?
Yes, I guess I've been fortunate because at one time, groups like NACASI would reach out to the industries and say, "Hey, can you help with some of this?"
Hmm.
And some accept the call, and most don't, or most send some uninterested uh, person to represent them, and that's not very productive either.
Right.
Um, but I don't have an advice. I can't say, hey, call this person here. They're a broker. They're going to hook you up. Okay. So it will take some initiative, but that's where
Right.
some of the research monies are too.
Hmm.
So if somebody is looking for some grants and match sharing and things like that, they would see that, yes, and especially now with some of the recent legislation that we've had, NACASI is involved in actually some funding also.
Hmm.
So that's can be quite important with a very fast turnaround. So
Yeah.
this is not a long delayed approach in working with them. Um, Adjunct positions can help. With that, naturally comes some graduate students. Sometimes these can be for some very short turnaround projects. I'll just give you an example. Uh, Years ago, we acquired some timberlands, excuse me, Rayonier acquired some timberlands in the state of Oklahoma and in southeast Oklahoma. And there was a real dearth of volume and weight equations. And a weight in that area was very important. So we funded a graduate student from Oklahoma State University, and in 2 years we had new volume and weight equations and for loblolly pine in southeast Oklahoma. Well worth the effort. But getting involved with the universities can be very useful and very gratifying for me too. I enjoy that, and I would say this is a logical avenue then for people outside of academia to get involved in that and really sort of steer the direction
Yeah.
that helps industry.
I personally was really excited. My major professor in the PhD, Dr. Harold Burkhart, who passed last year, we were about to have a project with a grad student to develop new slash pine equations in the West Gulf. And I don't know if you remember the slash pine equations in the West Gulf, but they are quite dated. And so we were getting that project started towards the end of last year. And so, but unfortunately, he passed during that time. So
Yes.
that project is becoming a little bit slower since then, but hopefully now with Dr. Corey Green there at Virginia Tech, we can hopefully continue that project. But
Sure. Sure.
for me, I'm with you. It's very exciting now being on the industry side of things to be able to have that foot in academia and be able to help steer some of those problems and projects.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I might also mention working with all these groups, one acquires a network of people that you can count on, a network of people also that will ask you for some favors.
Right.
But
Always.
it's a natural lead later into consulting. So if they want to
Yeah.
go into a consulting environment, it's a natural lead. And also, since retirement, I had a teaching position at a university in Brazil, yet another one, the Federal University of Lavras. And that was also very enjoyable, very rewarding for me.
Mm.
And the impetus for these last two articles that I've written in forest ecology and management that address both CFI and address these volume equation issues.
Right.
One of the things I thought I would do, this might sound like my opportunity to pontificate, but I thought I would try to address two areas of challenges. One is a challenge in general of forest biometrics research, and then later just some brief comments on academia and the formation of new biometricians. So allow me to sort of comment or
Yeah, please.
pontificate. I hope it doesn't sound like pontificate. Our challenges to forest biometrics research. At the University of Georgia, a model followed not all by all universities, but emulated by some. We felt that in biometrics, it was really a tripod of knowledge, or a three-legged stool, you might say. It was focused on growth and yield, sampling, and operations research, which was used for harvest scheduling. And in some departments, the operations research, harvest scheduling is more of a task of forest economists. But at the University of Georgia, it used to be a key component of forest biometrics. So let me talk about growth and yield. What's our challenge there? I really think it's incorporation of some of the environmental variables.
Yeah.
So we have those variables out there. I think we can start incorporating them into our growth and yield model. We'll have challenges with them. They're all highly correlated with each other, and so we're going to have multicollinearity, severe multicollinearity. And so we have to look at new techniques to ameliorate or dissipate those effects of multicollinearity. But I think we can, and so this sort of ties us back into some of the research co-ops that are, whether they be looking at soils or other climatic variables, how do we get them into our models?
Mm.
In the fast-growing plantations in South America, a graduate student that I had who graduated from NC State, Dr. Enrique Scofaro, and I were able to demonstrate that a simple environmental variable, water balance, this goes back to work done in the late 50s and 60s by Thornwaith and Mather, water balance models. We were able to show that explained a difference of 9 meters in dominant height. That's an extraordinary spread in dominant height expression at age 6, with fast growing ukes, of course.
Yeah.
Just by an environmental variable. So I think that's one of our challenges. In sampling, finally, we're going to get this right with remote sensing mensuration.
Do you think so?
Remote
Are we
sensing,
close?
yes, I do. I feel we're on the cusp, but it's been overpromised for 4 decades.
Yes.
Remote sensing.
And I think sometimes it's still being overpromised, the capabilities
Yes, of course. And
there.
when one hears the fantastic claims,
Yeah.
now that carbon modeling has come on, we hear the fantastic claims again. These
Mm,
things come in cycles.
yes.
But I feel that it's time to get it right though. So
Yeah.
it will involve
Yeah.
getting that proper allocation of the permanent plots, temporary plots, and the auxiliary information could be plots or census of auxiliary information.
Mm,
And we should know that auxiliary information is not the principal variable.
right.
So what comes off the remote sensed image is not our final variable of interest. We do need indeed boots on the ground. I
Yes.
think we've got to get it right though.
Yes.
Is a biometrician from the West Coast, Jim Flewelling, Dr. Jim Flewelling. He once said, "This remote sensing is just too right. We gotta use it." But also, manifests a great exasperation that it had been misused, and we've had a lot of really remarkable fiascos and failures with the remote sensing promises. And so we've got to get it right, though.
Hmm.
That's what I feel our challenge is in the area of sampling.
Yes.
And then finally, in just briefly with respect to operations research, harvest scheduling, I think our focus will be on getting large scale problems where we're looking at hundreds of thousands of acres of timberlands, perhaps spanning numerous states. Large scale problems getting integer solutions so we don't have this problem of divisibility, assigning a stand 6/10 of this regime and 4/10 of that regime,
Right. Right.
getting that thing right, and returning to a focus on optimality
Mm,
and not on report writers,
right.
slick report writers. Because I feel that's what's happened in recent time is optimality, which many professors have addressed, has been forgotten or
Hmm.
not implemented into software. And
Right.
what's driving software is slick report writers. Can you give it to me this way, that way, this? And we've lost that urgency to focus on optimality. We're leaving something on the table. We could be managing these forests better.
And I don't want to pick on any individual software, but these strata-based optimization softwares that really don't give you any kind of stand level optimization, it doesn't give you the ability to apply choices to individual stands and an optimal solution. You have to take that strata based and then apply that yourself, right? And for what you said, applying 6/10 of this regime and 4/10 of this regime doesn't make sense for a forest manager. They're saying, I have the stand. What are you crazy biometricians doing out there with your models? I'm going to treat this
Precisely.
one way. And I think uh, one thing back to academia is more training and optimization for biometricians and growth and yield type people, because without that understanding of even basic linear optimization or mixed integer programming, they're going to use the software of the day. And so I am fortunate that I had that background and I'm able to, build my own linear programming models and use, out of the box software to do that kind of thing without having to rely on some kind of strata level optimization tool.
Perfect. Well, I think, Dr. Allen, you aren't alone. There are others like you. Maybe you don't know the entire network out there, but I would love to see a change.
Yeah.
Manifested my exasperation oftentimes with Dr. Pete Bettinger at the University of Georgia saying, hey, I'd love to see more implementation of these heuristics out there.
Mm,
But what seems to be driving the software of choice are the report writers.
right.
Can it give the information to me this way, that way? And that's not. I understand how we got there, but it's time to really focus on optimality once again.
Right. Yeah.
If I could, let me tell you just briefly what I see some challenges in the future for academia and the formation of new forest biometricians. Some of the very large universities with great supporting departments in mathematics and statistics
Hmm.
have been dropping their forestry curriculum. This could be University of California, University of Illinois, University of Michigan. There's some notable exceptions, certainly here in the Southeast, but for the forest biometricians, those supporting departments, uh, mathematics and statistics, are really paramount. And what I believe is happening is some of the more regional type of forestry programs, um, the teaching loads are quite heavy on the faculty, much less resources and much less support from departments across campus. And I think this will be some problem. What I'm essentially talking about is actually biometrics, I think in the future will be restricted to much fewer universities
Right.
that will be really able to do this type of work. That's what I'm seeing. Uh,
Yeah, I think I'm seeing the same. I think we're seeing in many cases biometricians who retire or leave the position for some reason or another are not being replaced with forest
Precisely.
biometricians. In some cases, they're not being replaced by traditional biometricians, and I think that's okay. We are seeing some innovation there, but to actually take some level of biometrics or geomatics out of the program completely, I think is a bit of a shame, and we're going to see a bit of a change in, like you mentioned, where the students are going. So, a place like UGA or Virginia Tech is going to continue to be a powerhouse, whereas the smaller universities maybe not as much.
Sure, sure.
But
Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
And I would say for others that are listening, we have seen a large turnover in biometricians across the Southeast and the U.S. in general, and we're not seeing those folks at our Southern Mensurationists, Western Mensurationists, Northern Mensurationists meetings, and I encourage all of them to go to those meetings and to get to know everyone. And it's really it's a small group of wonderful people who enjoy a beer and a conversation around equations and sampling.
Precisely. And I would echo all of that. The bottom line, though, is something is pretty good for students.
Hmm.
Always has been and always will be. Something we used to joke about, while sharing a beer, even as a
Yeah,
student, is there are no unemployed forest biometricians. There is full employment opportunities for them.
right.
They are desperately needed. We always said that we had a dearth of older data information. So biometricians were desperately needed to try to make models that would predict the performance, the economic return to some new intensive management technique. We need them and we will always need them. And so the opportunities are really abound for a young man or a woman that wants to pursue this area.
Hmm.
They can do very well in their career.
Hmm.
Uh, but I believe the opportunities will be at a restricted number of universities. And you're absolutely right. Many biometricians are not being replaced. They're putting on what they call quantitative uh, forest ecologists. And then there's a distinct lack of productivity in biometric areas.
Right.
Well, that pretty much wraps up the topics that I wanted to cover. But if you've got some questions, Mickey, that you would like to throw at me, we can certainly handle. We're
Yeah.
just over an hour, I think. But
Yeah, and we're going to wrap up pretty soon,
okay,
but there's we kind of danced around the topic a little bit of academia and industry and how those kind of prop each other up. But I think one of the things now, having been on both sides of the fence, it's a short fence, but it is a fence. Seeing a little bit of a disconnect because, I think in academia these days you have to chase the research dollars because that's how you get money to have grad students and publish. I understand that. But also at the same time, some of the problems that they are trying to answer are not necessarily the same problems we have in industry. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect. Um, do you have any comments on that, on what you've seen in your years on both sides?
Yes, well, actually, that's an excellent discussion because I ran into this just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. The Forest Inventory and Analysis Program of the U.S. Forest Service is ready to issue, I believe, sometime this year, new volume and biomass equations.
Yes.
And these are called NSVB, which stands for National Scale Volume and Biomass Equations, and for a whole plethora of species. Of course, I'm focused on species 131, and in the FIA code, that's a loblolly pine, and for their plantations. So this will be very valuable work. We do want to have a full process for evaluation of our forests. And should we really see the carbon markets take off, we need to account for biomass and all of the tree components. But it would seem to me that somehow lost in all of this collection of new data was the fact no interest or no collection of green weight outside bark. What drives our forest products industry?
Right.
And this is an important industry nationwide and worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure how this interest in green weight outside bark was not manifested with the Forest Service, but their focus was on dry weight. And so I had to really resort to some unusual approaches to try to get new estimates of green weight outside bark, and not wholly satisfactory.
Yeah.
So yes, there can be a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
Research dollars will occasionally go into these areas, these glamour areas, you might say carbon. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But forget the traditional industries too, which are still needed and still really should be a partner in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the partnership does get lost.
Yeah. And I think maybe there has also been a little bit of disconnect on the industry side as well, where, not in all cases, but I think 20, 30, 40 years ago, the industry was much more involved in funding master's and PhD projects, whereas these days it's maybe relatively not as much. And so I think that could also be a fault of the industry for not being as involved as they should be.
Oh, I think your comments are right on. They're just spot on.
Yeah.
Industry can up it more. That's why it's important that we get the professionals like yourself involved. They can be that conduit of information between the industry and academia.
Right.
And keep the research focus pertinent, helpful for all, and keep her going. And let's try to keep forest products industry competitive in this country.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, again, spot on and very important. And, I think we've solved all of the problems for today. Let's wrap it up. Thank you so much, John Paul, for sharing with us and, sharing your story and sharing the future. And thank you again for being on here.
It's been a delight. Really, it has. Especially parts where I got to pontificate.
Yeah.
So thank you. So thank you so much. Megan.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Right on.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the podcast as much as I did. I had a wonderful time talking with Dr. McTague, who's just a wonderful conversationalist and an all-around great human being. Now, this podcast was made possible through the sponsorship of my employer, Larson & McGowan, And I can't thank Barrett McCall and Alexander McCall enough for giving me the freedom to pursue this passion project of mine. So for all of your forest management, forest analysts, and forest geospatial needs, give Larson McGowan a call. Now, this episode and all future episodes are dedicated in the memory of Dr. Harold Burkhart, my advisor, my mentor, and my friend. He was originally intended to be the first guest on this podcast, but of course, that didn't happen. We miss him, and this one's for you, Dr. Burkhart. So thank you, everyone, again, for joining us, and I'll see you next time.